Oh, hey everybody. Welcome back to the Daily Six. You ever come into a full closet and look at this and go, what in the world am I going to wear today? I got nothing. Do you ever wonder if God cares about what you wear? We might actually be surprised. I've been reading Genesis chapter 3. You want to come with me? Get Genesis 3 open. We're going to see something that might surprise us about how God feels about our clothing. Genesis 3. Grab it. Let's go talk. I've been studying Genesis chapter 3 this morning and digging around in the scriptures, finding some correlations that I think the Lord has really shown me and something he's spoken to me that I hope will minister to you as well. You might remember the context of Genesis chapter 3. This is where that crisis of sin sets in. God had placed Adam and Eve in a garden. There was a perfection there. They walked around with God. They communicated with him in the cool of the day. And it says the last verse of Genesis chapter 2 that the man and his wife were both naked and they felt no shame. And, when we read that today, we can almost even get some imagery in our mind, some Hollywood rated R kind of imagery pops in your head. But that's because sin has infected our concept of relationships between men and women and the community God has designed us to be in, right? So now, today, that state of being unclothed is very shameful and in fact is reserved for the most intimate of relationships now. But it wasn't always that way until sin had corrupted our knowledge of self. Sin had corrupted our sense of identity. So when the devil comes along and he tempts Adam and Eve to know good and evil, to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, means to embrace and know and pull into yourself an awareness, an experiential awareness of evil. And boy, didn't that really train wreck the whole thing. Well, notice what happened when they ate. Genesis 3 verse 7 records that then the eyes of both of them were opened and they realized they were naked. So what happens here is that sin now has reinterpreted their vision of themselves. That's pretty powerful. So what do? They sewed fig leaves together and they made coverings for themselves. So they're now awakened. They're now aware of the distance and the gap and the awkwardness between each other. So they did what all of us do when we're caught in the consequences of our crisis, caught in the consequences of our sin. We take it into our own hands and we do something to try to cover it up. And so for them, it was to go grab fig leaves, from the fruit around them. And they, you've seen the paintings, right, of Adam and Eve in this condition. And then verse 8. The man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God as he walked in the garden in the cool of the day. And they hid from the Lord God among the trees of the garden. I do this, don't you? That when I'm dealing with the shame and the brokenness of my sin, I want to pull away from the Lord. But the Lord God, verse 9, but the Lord God called to the man, "Where are you?" And he answered, I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid. And so he said, God's response, verse 11, who told you you were naked? How did you figure that out? You weren't supposed to have an awareness that nakedness was a deal. And so Adam explains and he justifies. He says, well, the woman you put here with me. You see that in verse 12? The woman, she did it. She gave me some of the fruit. And so the Lord God, what is it you've done? So he goes through, and we've read this before, all the various reactions, called curses in the scriptures, but it's really the natural consequence, the outflow of what occurred there. But then here's what stood out to me. The very end of chapter 3, after God has done all this work of explaining to them the consequences and the outcome of the knowledge of evil being rooted in them. Look at this, verse 21. The Lord God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife, and he clothed them. He clothed them. Friends, as I was reading this morning, something stood out to me. And it relates to this character of Jesus that we're now looking at today, right? We're looking at this whole Old Testament series, 45 different characters in the Old Testament. We started last week with God himself. This week, we're looking at Jesus. And here's the thought that struck out to me. Why did God involve Jesus in creation? Why was he in fact the creator? Learned yesterday that it was his first impulse, his authorship was the idea of salvation was the beginning of everything about creation. But notice this, when it says that God clothed Adam and Eve, God took on the responsibility to cover over their sin. And something jumped in my mind, and I went to my concordance and I looked up the word clothed. And sure enough, Galatians 3:27 tells us that you and I have clothed ourselves with Christ. See, I think God does in fact care what you and I wear. And it's not the threads in the cotton and whatever else, the polyester, if you're still into that. God cares that you and I are not clothed with our own efforts, our own fig leaves to cover over that which we're ashamed of. God himself wants to clothe us with Jesus Christ. The security and the comfort and the presence of him with us in Jesus. Boy, that stood out to me. Could you spend 6 more minutes and spend a little bit of time with the Lord asking him, show me how Jesus wraps me up and covers over everything that I'm ashamed of? Can you give God 6 more minutes? Make that your prayer. Talk to him about that. And come on back tomorrow. We're going to keep going for Jesus right here in the Old Testament.